The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocking M Ranch as Robert Mackenzie stood on his front porch, watching his 3 children run wild through the yard like untamed horses. His 8-year-old daughter Lucy chased her 6-year-old brother, Billy, with a wooden stick, while baby Rose sat in the dirt, her dress stained and her face streaked with tears that nobody had bothered to wipe away. Robert rubbed his tired eyes and tried to remember when everything had fallen apart. 6 months ago, his world had been perfect. His wife, Helen, had filled their home with laughter and warmth. The children had been well-behaved and happy. The ranch had run like clockwork. Now, Helen was buried on the hill behind the house, taken by the influenza that swept through Montana like wildfire, and Robert felt like he was drowning in responsibilities he never knew existed. "Boss, we need to talk." Robert turned to see his foreman, old Pete, climbing the porch steps with a grim expression. Pete had worked the ranch for 20 years and had never looked this serious before. "What's wrong now, Pete?" Robert asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. "It's the men, boss. They're talking about leaving. Half of them already have." Pete removed his hat and twisted it in his weathered hands. "They say you're not the same man you used to be, and they're..." "Right. The cattle are scattered across 3 counties, the fences are falling down, and nobody knows what work needs doing because you haven't given orders in weeks." Robert wanted to argue, but he knew Pete was telling the truth. Since Helen's death, he'd barely left his study except to eat silent meals with his children and collapse into bed each night. The ranch that had once been his pride and joy now felt like a burden too heavy to carry. "And the children, boss," Pete continued, his voice gentler now. "They need someone who knows how to care for them. That woman you hired last week lasted exactly 3 days before she packed her bags and left without even asking for her wages. She said Billy bit her," Robert muttered, remembering the scene. His son had indeed bitten the stern-faced woman when she tried to force him to eat his vegetables. Before Helen's death, Billy had been a cheerful, talkative boy. Now he barely spoke and seemed angry at the world. "That's the 4th one this month, boss. Word's getting around that the Mackenzie children are impossible to handle. No decent woman wants to come work here anymore." Robert watched Lucy tackle Billy to the ground, both of them covered in dust and shouting at each other. Baby Rose had crawled over to the porch steps and was trying to eat a handful of dirt. This wasn't the life Helen had wanted for their children. She'd dreamed of Lucy growing up to be a proper lady, of Billy becoming a strong, honest man, of Rose having all the opportunities she'd never had growing up poor in the mountains. "What do you suggest, Pete?" Robert asked, feeling defeated. "Put an advertisement in the newspapers. Not just the local ones, but the big city papers too. Offer good wages and be honest about what you need. There's got to be someone out there who can help these children and get this ranch back on track." That evening, after the children had finally fallen asleep in their beds, unwashed and wearing yesterday's clothes, Robert sat at his desk with a piece of paper and a pen. Writing had never been his strong suit, but he had to try. Wanted: experienced woman to care for 3 young children on cattle ranch. Must be patient, kind, and capable of managing household duties. Good wages offered to the right person. Remote. Location requires strong character and ability to work independently. He stared at the words, wondering if anyone would respond. Who would want to come to the middle of nowhere to care for 3 wild children and work for a man who could barely take care of himself? Over the next 2 weeks, letters trickled in slowly. Most were from women who clearly hadn't understood what they were signing up for. One lady wrote asking if the ranch had electric lights and indoor plumbing. Another wanted to know if there was a train station nearby because she liked to visit the city on weekends. A few seemed promising until they met the children. The first woman, a stern-looking lady from Denver, lasted 2 days before declaring the children completely without discipline and demanding Robert send her back to town immediately. The second woman seemed kind enough, but when Billy threw a tantrum and refused to eat his breakfast, she burst into tears and said she couldn't handle children who acted like wild animals. Robert was beginning to think Pete's plan wouldn't work when a letter arrived that was different from all the others. "Dear Mr. Mackenzie," it began in neat, careful handwriting. I read your advertisement with great interest. I have experience caring for children who have suffered loss and understand the special patience required during such difficult times. I am recently widowed myself and seeking a new beginning where I can be useful to a family in need. I can arrive within the week if my qualifications meet your requirements. The letter was signed simply Catherine Wells and included references from families in Denver who praised her work with their children. What struck Robert most was her mention of understanding loss. Most of the other applicants had ignored the fact that these were children who had lost their mother, treating them as if they were simply misbehaving rather than grieving. Robert wrote back immediately, asking her to come as soon as possible. He offered to pay her travel expenses and promised she would have her own room and fair wages. He didn't mention how desperate he was or how badly he needed anyone, to help him save his family. 3 days later, old Pete brought news from town that a woman had arrived on the afternoon train asking for directions to the Rocking M Ranch. She had 2 suitcases and a trunk, and she'd paid the hotel keeper extra to store her belongings until someone could fetch them. She's staying at the hotel tonight, Pete reported. Says she come out to the ranch first thing in the morning to meet the children before making any decisions. That night, Robert barely slept. He cleaned the house as best he could, scrubbing dishes that had been sitting in the sink for days and trying to make the place look less like a disaster. He even attempted to wash the children's faces and comb their hair, though Billy fought him every step of the way and Lucy declared that she liked being dirty. "Why do we need another lady?" Lucy asked suspiciously. "The last one was mean and smelled like mothballs." "This one might be different," Robert said, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. "She's coming to help take care of you and make sure you're happy and healthy." "I don't want anyone taking care of me," Lucy said firmly. "I can take care of Billy and Rose myself." Robert's heart broke a little more. His 8-year-old daughter had been trying to fill her mother's shoes for months, and it wasn't fair to her. She should be playing with dolls and learning to read, not changing her baby sister's diapers and making sure her brother ate his meals. As dawn broke over the ranch, Robert stood on the porch again, watching the road for any sign of a wagon or rider. The children were still asleep, giving him a few precious moments of quiet to think about what he would say to this Catherine Wells. How could he explain that his children weren't really wild or mean, just hurting in ways they didn't understand? How could he make her see that beneath their difficult behavior were 3 small hearts that desperately needed love and stability? The sound of horse hooves on the dirt road made his heart jump. A wagon was approaching, driven by Tom from the livery stable, and sitting beside him was a woman in a dark blue dress and simple bonnet. Even from a distance, Robert could see that she sat straight and calm, not fidgeting or looking nervous like the others had. This was it. Either Catherine Wells would be the answer to his prayers, or she would be just another disappointment in a long line of failures. Robert straightened his shirt, took a deep breath, and prepared to meet the woman who might save his family. The wagon pulled up in front of the house just as the sun cleared the mountains, painting everything in golden light. It felt like a sign, though Robert wasn't sure if it was a good one or bad one. All he could do was hope that this time things would be different. Catherine Wells stepped down from the wagon with careful grace, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. The moment she saw the ranch house, memories flooded back like a dam bursting. This was the home her sister Helen had described in her letters 15 years ago, back when they still wrote to each other. The wide front porch, the tall windows that caught the morning light, the mountains rising behind it like protective giants. But it was the children who nearly brought her to her knees. Lucy stood in the doorway, wild brown hair falling around her shoulders, wearing a dress that hadn't been properly washed in weeks. She had Helen's stubborn chin and the same way of tilting her head when she was suspicious. Billy peeked out from behind his sister, his face smudged with dirt but his eyes bright and curious. And baby Rose, sitting on a blanket in the yard, had Helen's soft curls and the same little nose that Catherine remembered kissing when Helen was just a baby herself. "You must be Mr. Mackenzie," Catherine said, forcing her voice to stay steady as she looked at the tall, weathered man on the porch. Robert Mackenzie looked older than his 42 years, his dark hair streaked with gray that hadn't been there in the wedding photograph Helen had sent years ago. His eyes held a sadness so deep it made Catherine's chest ache. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you for coming such a long way." Robert's voice was rough, like he hadn't used it much lately. "These are my children, Lucy, Billy, and Rose." Catherine knelt down so she was at Lucy's eye level. The little girl stepped forward protectively, positioning herself between Catherine and her younger siblings. "Hello, Lucy," Catherine said softly. "I'm Catherine. I've come to help your father take care of you and your brother and sister." "We don't need taking care of," Lucy said firmly. "I can do it myself." The words broke Catherine's heart. This little girl was trying so hard to be the woman of the house, just like Helen had done when their own mother died and left Helen too. Raise Catherine. The family resemblance was so strong it hurt to look at her. "I'm sure you're very good at taking care of everyone," Catherine replied. "But sometimes even the best helpers need a little help themselves." Billy stepped out from behind Lucy, studying Catherine with curious eyes. "Are you going to leave like the other ladies did?" "I hope not," Catherine said honestly. "I'd like to stay and get to know all of you, if you'll let me." Over the next few days, Catherine threw herself into understanding the rhythm of the broken household. She woke before dawn and worked until long after the children were asleep, but it wasn't work that felt like drudgery. Every task brought back memories of Helen and the home they'd shared as children. She found herself humming the same lullabies their mother had sung, the ones Helen had probably sung to these very children. When she organized the kitchen, she put things where Helen would have put them, remembering her sister's practical nature and love of order. She planted flowers in the neglected garden beds, choosing the same bright yellow marigolds Helen had always favored. The children began to respond to her patience in ways that surprised everyone, especially Robert. Lucy, who had been fierce and defiant with the other women, started following Catherine around the house, watching her work and occasionally offering to help. Billy, who had barely spoken in months, began chattering about the ranch animals and asking Catherine endless questions about everything from why the sky was blue to where babies came from. Baby Rose was the most dramatic change. The child who had cried constantly and refused to eat properly began smiling and laughing. She would reach for Catherine with chubby arms and babble happily when Catherine sang to her during bath time. She hasn't been that content since. Robert stopped himself, but Catherine knew he meant since Helen died. She saw him watching her sometimes from the doorway, a puzzled expression on his face, as if he couldn't quite figure out why his children responded to her so differently than they had to the others. Catherine understood why, though it made her feel guilty. She wasn't really a stranger to these children. She was family, even if they didn't know it. Every instinct she had for caring for them came from the same place that had made Helen such a wonderful mother. They were responding to something familiar, something that felt like home. The guilt was eating at her. Every morning when she woke up in the small room off the kitchen that had been prepared for her, she told herself she would confess the truth that day. She would tell Robert who she really was and why she had come. But then Lucy would smile at her, or Billy would grab her hand to show her something important, or Rose would fall asleep in her arms, and Catherine would convince herself to wait. Just one more day. Robert was changing too. The man who had barely left his study was now joining them for meals, actually talking to his children instead of sitting in silence. He'd started paying attention to the ranch again, spending mornings with his foreman and afternoons mending fences or checking on the cattle. In the evenings he would sit on the porch after the children were in bed, and sometimes Catherine would bring him coffee and they would talk about small things, the weather or the children's progress or plans for the ranch. During these quiet conversations, Catherine learned about the man her sister had married. Robert was kind and thoughtful, but he carried guilt like a heavy coat he couldn't take off. He blamed himself for not being able to save Helen from the influenza, for not being a better father to his children after she died, for letting the ranch fall apart when his family needed stability most. Helen would have known what to do, he said one evening, staring out at the mountains. She always knew how to make everything right. I feel like I'm stumbling around in the dark most of the time." Catherine wanted to tell him that Helen had struggled too, that she'd written letters full of worry about being a good enough mother and wife. But Catherine Wells was supposed to be a stranger who had never known his wife, so she just listened and offered what comfort she could. "Children are stronger than we think," Catherine said carefully. "They understand more than we give them credit for. Your children know you love them, even when you're struggling." "How do you know so much about children who've lost a parent?" Robert asked, and Catherine's heart nearly stopped. I lost my mother when I was young," she said, which was true enough. "I remember what it felt like to have adults around me who were trying their best, but didn't always know what to do. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either." Catherine hated the deception, but she was terrified of what would happen if Robert knew who she really was. Would he think she had come to spy on them? Would he worry that she was trying to take Helen's place in some inappropriate way? Would he send her away, leaving the children to suffer through another loss? 3 months into her stay, Catherine realized she had a bigger problem than just the deception. She was falling in love with Robert Mackenzie, not because he reminded her of Helen or because she was lonely, but because of who he was as a man. She loved his gentleness with the children, his dedication to making things right, his quiet strength and the way he was slowly healing from his grief. But loving Robert felt like betraying Helen's memory. How could she develop feelings for her dead sister's husband? What kind of person did that make her? The guilt was becoming unbearable, made worse by the fact that she sometimes caught Robert looking at her with something warmer than gratitude in his eyes. The situation was becoming impossible to maintain. Catherine found herself making small mistakes, letting slip little pieces of knowledge she shouldn't have had. She knew that Lucy was afraid of thunderstorms because Helen had mentioned it in a letter years ago. She knew that Billy had a birthmark on his shoulder shaped like a crescent moon because Helen had described it when he was born. She knew that Robert liked his coffee strong and his eggs cooked soft because Helen had complained about having to remember these details when they were first married. Each slip made her heart race, waiting for Robert to notice and ask questions she couldn't answer. The children were getting more attached to her every day, and she was getting more attached to all of them. The thought of leaving them was becoming unbearable, but the thought of staying while living a lie was equally painful. Something had to give, and Catherine was beginning to fear that when it did, it would destroy the fragile happiness they had all begun to build together. The truth had a way of coming out, and when it did, Catherine wasn't sure any of them would survive it intact. The first crack in Catherine's carefully built wall of secrets came on a Tuesday morning in late January. She was braiding Lucy's hair for school, humming softly while she worked, when Lucy suddenly went very still. "Miss Catherine," Lucy said, in a small voice, "you hum the same songs Mama used to hum?" Catherine's hands froze in Lucy's hair. Her heart started beating so fast she felt dizzy. "Do I? I suppose many mothers sing the same songs to their children. But you hum them exactly the same way," Lucy insisted, turning around to look at Catherine, with those sharp, intelligent eyes that were so much like Helen's. Even the little extra notes that Mama added that weren't in the real song. Catherine forced herself to smile and finish the braid. "Maybe your Mama and I learned the songs from the same person when we were little girls. It was close enough too?" The truth to satisfy Lucy, but Catherine spent the rest of the day in a state of panic. She had to be more careful. The children were noticing things, and sooner or later, Robert would notice too. But being careful became harder and harder as winter settled over the ranch. The familiar rhythms of caring for Helen's children felt so natural that Catherine often forgot she was supposed to be a stranger. When Billy scraped his knee, she automatically reached for the special salve Helen had written about making from herbs in the garden. When Rose wouldn't stop crying one evening, Catherine found herself arranging the blankets in the exact pattern Helen had described in her letters, the one that had always calmed the baby. "You're good with her," Robert said, appearing in the doorway of the nursery as Catherine finally got Rose settled. "It's like you know exactly what she needs." "Some babies are easier to read than others," Catherine replied, but her voice sounded strange even to her own ears. Robert stepped closer, studying her face in the lamplight. Catherine, can I ask you something? Her stomach dropped. Of course. Where did you say you were from originally? Before Denver, Catherine's mind raced. She had told him Denver because that's where she'd been living with her late husband, but she'd never mentioned where she'd grown up. I moved around a lot as a child. My father worked for the railroad. It wasn't exactly a lie. Their father had worked for the railroad for a few years when she and Helen were young before he'd settled down to farming. But she could see, in Robert's eyes, that he sensed something wasn't quite right. The second crack came 2 weeks later, during the worst blizzard anyone could remember. The snow had been falling for 3 days straight, and the wind howled around the house like a living thing trying to get inside. The children were restless from being cooped up, and even Catherine was feeling the strain of keeping everyone entertained and calm. That's when little Rose started running a high fever. Catherine had been through this before with her own children, back in Denver, but seeing Helen's baby so sick brought back all the terror she'd felt when she'd received the letter telling her that Helen had died of influenza. She couldn't lose Rose too, she wouldn't. We need to get her fever down, Catherine told Robert, who was pacing the floor of the nursery like a caged animal. Do you have any willow bark? Or feverfew? I don't know, Robert said desperately. Helen always handled the medicine. I don't know what any of those things are. Catherine was already moving, her hands working automatically as she searched through the kitchen cabinets. She found the herbs exactly where she expected them to be, exactly where Helen would have kept them. She prepared the fever tea using the method their mother had taught both her and Helen, adding honey to make it palatable for a baby dot. As the night wore on, Catherine held Rose close, humming softly and checking her temperature every few minutes. Robert sat beside them, his face gray with worry and exhaustion. She's going to be all right, Catherine murmured, as much to herself as to Robert. She's strong, just like her mama was. You talk about Helen sometimes like you knew her, Robert said quietly. Catherine's blood turned to ice. What do? You mean little things? The way you say her name? The way you nod when I mention something she used to do, like you're not surprised by it. Robert's voice was thoughtful, not accusatory, but Catherine felt like he could see right through her. And the children respond to you like they've known you their whole lives. Children adapt quickly when they feel safe, Catherine said, but her voice was shaking now. Billy told me yesterday that you have the same hands as his mama. I told him that was silly, but then I looked, and Robert reached out and gently took Catherine's hand, turning it palm up in the lamplight. You do have the same hands. The same long fingers, the same small scar on your thumb. Catherine tried to pull her hand away, but Robert held it gently. Catherine, who are you really? Before she could answer, Rose's fever broke. The baby's breathing became easier, and her skin cooled to a normal temperature. Catherine sagged with relief, tears streaming down her face. She's going to be fine, she whispered. Yes, she is, Robert said. Thanks to you. Thanks to someone who knew exactly what to do, exactly where to find the right medicine, exactly how to care for a sick child in this house. His voice was getting stronger, more certain. Someone who's been in this house before, or at least someone who's learned about it from someone who lived here. Catherine looked down at Rose, sleeping peacefully in her arms, and felt the last of her resistance crumble. She was so tired of lying, so tired of pretending to be someone she wasn't. My name is Catherine Morrison, she said quietly. Catherine. Wells was my married name, but my husband died 2 years ago. Before I moved to Denver, I was Catherine Morrison, Helen's sister. The silence that followed was so complete that Catherine could hear her own heartbeat. Robert stared at her like she'd spoken in a foreign language. Helen's sister, he repeated slowly. But Helen didn't have any family. She told me her parents died and she had no siblings. She told you that because our parents forced her to choose between you and us, Catherine said, the words pouring out now that she'd started. They said you were beneath her, that she was ruining her life by marrying a rancher. They told her, if she married you, she was dead to them. So she chose you, and they kept their word? They acted like she never existed. Robert's face went through a dozen different emotions. Shock, confusion, anger, and something that might have been understanding. "I tried to find her," Catherine continued. "After our parents died, I tried to write, but I didn't know where she'd gone. I didn't even know her married name. Then my husband got sick, and I had to focus on taking care of him. When he died, I found some old papers of his, and in them was a letter from Helen she'd written to him years ago, asking him to tell me that she was happy and that she missed me. The letter had your name and the name of the ranch." "So you came here pretending to be someone else?" Robert said, and now there was definitely anger in his voice. "I came here because I needed to know that Helen's children were all right," Catherine said, her own voice getting stronger. "I came here because I'd lost everyone I loved except for 3 children I'd never met, and I couldn't stand the thought of them growing up without knowing they had family who cared about them. By lying to me, by lying to them, by being too afraid to tell the truth," Catherine corrected. "I was going to tell you who I was, but then I saw how much the children needed stability, and I was afraid you'd send me away if you knew I was Helen's sister. I was afraid you'd think I was trying to replace her or judge you or take the children away." Robert stood up abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the storm. "I need to think about this, Catherine, or whoever you are. I need to think about what this means." "I understand," Catherine said, though her heart was breaking. "I'll pack my things in the morning." "Don't," Robert said, without turning around. "Don't pack anything yet. Rose needs you, and the other children have been through enough changes. But we're going to have to figure out how to move forward from here. Because I can't have someone in my house who's living a lie, no matter how good her reasons were." Catherine nodded, even though he couldn't see her. She understood his anger, and she accepted it. She'd known this day would come eventually. She'd just hoped it would come later, after she'd had more time with Helen's children. After she'd been able to give them more of the stability they needed, now all she could do was wait and see if Robert Mackenzie was the kind of man who could forgive her for loving his family enough to lie in order to be near them. The next 3 days passed like a funeral. Robert barely spoke to Catherine except when absolutely necessary, and when he did, his voice was cold and distant. He spent most of his time in the barn or out checking cattle, coming in only for silent meals where the tension was so thick even the children noticed. Lucy kept looking back and forth between her father and Catherine with worried eyes. Billy had stopped his cheerful chatter and gone back to the quiet, withdrawn behavior he'd shown right after his mother died. Even baby Rose seemed to sense something was wrong, fussing more than usual and clinging to Catherine whenever Robert was in the room. Catherine felt like she was walking on broken glass. Every morning she woke up expecting Robert to tell her to pack her bags and leave. Every evening she went to bed wondering if tomorrow would be her last day with the children. The uncertainty was almost worse than if he'd just sent her away immediately. On Thursday morning, old Pete knocked on the kitchen door while Catherine was making breakfast. His weathered face looked troubled as he removed his hat. "Morning, Miss Catherine. Is the boss around?" "He's in the barn," Catherine replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Is something wrong?" "Well, that's what I'm trying to figure out," Pete said, scratching his gray beard. "The boys are asking questions. They want to know why the boss is acting like someone died again. They're worried about their jobs, worried about whether the ranch is in trouble." Catherine's heart sank. She hadn't thought about how Robert's behavior would affect the other ranch hands. These men depended on the Rocking M for their livelihoods, and they'd already been through one crisis when Helen died. "I'm sure Mr. Mackenzie will talk to them when he's ready," Catherine said, but Pete didn't look convinced. "Miss Catherine, I don't know what's happened between you and the boss, but I hope you two can work it out. This family was finally starting to heal, and now it feels like we're back where we started." After Pete left, Catherine sat at the kitchen table with her head in her hands. She'd come here hoping to help Helen's children, but instead she might be making everything worse. Maybe Robert was right to be angry. Maybe she should have stayed away and left them alone. The breaking point came that afternoon when Lucy approached Catherine in the garden where she was half-heartedly pulling weeds. "Miss Catherine," Lucy said in a small voice, "are you going to leave us like the other ladies did?" Catherine looked up to see Lucy's eyes filled with tears she was trying hard not to shed. Behind her, Billy stood with his thumb in his mouth, a habit he'd broken months ago, but had returned to in the past few days. "I don't know, sweetheart," Catherine said honestly. "That's up to your father to decide. But we don't want you to go." Lucy said, her voice breaking. "You make everything better. You make it feel like ... She struggled to find the words. "Like Mama's still here, but not in a scary way, in a good way." Catherine pulled Lucy into her arms, her own tears finally spilling over. "Oh, Lucy, I don't want to leave you either. I love you and Billy and Rose so much." "Then why can't you stay?" Lucy asked. "Papa likes you too. I can see it in his eyes when he looks at you. So why is he being so mean now?" Before Catherine could answer, she heard footsteps behind them. Robert stood at the garden gate, and from the expression on his face, Catherine could tell he'd heard everything. "Lucy, take Billy inside and wash up for supper," Robert said quietly. "But Papa," Lucy started to protest. "Now, Lucy." After the children went inside, Robert walked slowly into the garden. He looked tired, older than his years, and Catherine's heart ached for him. "I heard what Lucy said," he began. "About you. Making it feel like Helen is still here." Catherine nodded, not trusting her voice. "I've been thinking about that," Robert continued. "About why the children took to you so quickly, why everything felt so natural with you here. At first I thought it was just because you were good with children, but now I understand. They were responding to something familiar, weren't they? Something that reminded them of their mother." "I suppose so," Catherine whispered. "And I was responding to it too," Robert admitted, his voice rough. "There were moments when you'd laugh or tilt your head a certain way. And for just a second it was like Helen was in the room again. I told myself I was imagining things, but I wasn't, was I?" Catherine shook her head. "Helen and I looked alike when we were younger. People used to mistake us for twins, even though she was 3 years older." Robert was quiet for a long moment, staring at the mountains in the distance. "I've been angry for 3 days," he said finally. "Angry that you lied to me, angry that you let me, that I started to care for you under false pretenses, but mostly angry at myself." "Why?" "Because I was falling in love with you," Robert said simply. "And I felt guilty about it, like I was betraying Helen's memory. But if you're Helen's sister, if you're family, then maybe ... He stopped and shook his head. "I don't know what to think anymore." Catherine's heart leaped at his words, but she forced herself to stay realistic. "Robert, I understand why you're angry. I understand if you can never trust me again. I lied to you for months." "You did," he agreed. "But I've been thinking about why you lied, and I think I understand. If someone told me there were children out there who were related to Helen, children who needed help, I would have moved heaven and earth to find them and make sure they were safe. Is that what you did?" Catherine nodded, tears streaming down her face. "When I got Helen's letter and realized she was dead, that her children were growing up without knowing they had an aunt who loved them, I couldn't stand it. I couldn't let them think they were alone in the world. So you came here not to deceive us, but to take care of us." "Yes." Robert reached out and gently wiped the tears from Catherine's cheek. "The children need you, Catherine. I can see that now more clearly than ever. These past few days, watching them slide backward, watching Lucy try so hard to be brave while her world falls apart again. I can't put them through another loss. What are you saying?" "I'm saying I want you to stay. Not as a housekeeper or a nanny, but as family, as their aunt, and as—" He paused, searching for the right words. "As whatever we can be to each other, if you're willing to try." Catherine stared at him in amazement. "You're not sending me away?" "I should probably be angry for longer," Robert said with a small smile. "But I'm too tired to stay angry, and life's too short to waste time on pride. The children love you, you love them, and I ... took a deep breath. "I love you too, Catherine Morrison. Not because you remind me of Helen, but because of who you are. Because you're brave enough to travel across the country to help children you'd never met. Because you're patient enough to help a broken man learn how to be a father again. Because you're kind enough to forgive me for being a fool these past few days." Catherine threw her arms around him, hardly daring to believe this was real. "I love you too," she whispered. "I was so afraid I'd ruined everything." "You didn't ruin anything," Robert said, holding her close. "You saved everything. You saved all of us." From the kitchen window, they could see Lucy's face pressed against the glass, grinning from ear to ear. She'd obviously been watching the whole conversation, and now she was jumping up and down with excitement. "I think we have an audience," Catherine laughed. "I think we'd better go inside and explain to the children that their Aunt Catherine is going to stay with them forever," Robert said. As they walked toward the house hand in hand, Catherine felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that she'd been carrying for years. She was finally home, finally with the family she'd thought she'd lost forever. Helen was gone, but her children were safe and loved. And somehow, in taking care of them, Catherine had found her own chance at happiness. Again, the deception was over, but the real story was just beginning. Spring came early to the Rocking M Ranch that year, as if the land itself was celebrating the healing that had begun to take root in the Mackenzie family. Catherine woke on a warm April morning to the sound of Lucy's laughter drifting through her bedroom window. Real laughter, the kind that bubbled up from deep inside and couldn't be contained. It had been 2 months since the truth came out, and the changes in the household were remarkable. Robert had kept his word about being honest with the children, sitting them all down the day after his conversation with Catherine in the garden. "Children, I have something important to tell you about Miss Catherine," he had said, gathering them in the living room. "Her real name is Catherine Morrison, and she's your mama's sister. That makes her your aunt." The reaction had been everything Catherine could have hoped for and more. Lucy had gasped with delight, immediately demanding to know if this meant Catherine was really family and would never have to leave. Billy had stared at Catherine with wide eyes before climbing into her lap and announcing that he'd always known she was special. Even baby Rose had seemed to understand something important was happening, clapping her hands and babbling happily. "Does this mean you knew our mama when she was little like us?" Lucy had asked, her eyes shining with curiosity. "I did," Catherine had answered, pulling out the small photograph she'd been carrying since Denver. "This is your mama and me when we were about your age." The children had crowded around the faded picture, marveling at how much their mother had looked like Catherine, asking dozens of questions about Helen's childhood that Catherine was finally free to answer over the following weeks. Catherine had shared stories she'd been holding back for months. She told them about how Helen had taught her to braid hair and make mud pies. She described how their mother had once climbed the tallest tree in their yard just to prove she could, and how she'd fallen and broken her arm, but had been more worried about getting in trouble than about the pain. "Mama was brave," Lucy had said with pride. "Very brave," Catherine had agreed. "And she passed that bravery on to all 3 of you." The sharing of memories had been healing for Catherine, too. For years, she'd had no one to talk to about Helen, no one who cared about the little sister who had taught her to sing and helped her through nightmares and shared secrets under blanket forts. Now she could keep Helen's memory alive for her children, and in doing so, she felt like she was finally able to say a proper goodbye to the sister she'd lost twice. Robert had been true to his word in other ways as well. He'd started courting Catherine properly, the way he should have from the beginning if circumstances had been different. He brought her wildflowers from the meadow, sat with her on the porch in the evenings, talking about everything and nothing, and treated her with a respect and tenderness that made her heart flutter like a young girl's. "I want to do this right," he told her one evening as they watched the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. "I want to court you as Robert Mackenzie courting Catherine Morrison, not as a widower desperately grateful to the woman who saved his family." "And what's the difference?" Catherine had asked, smiling. "The difference is that I'm choosing you because I love you, not because I need you," Robert had replied. "Though I do need you, and I am grateful. But more than that, I love your laugh. And the way you hum while you work. I love how patient you are with the children and how you never make them feel bad for missing their mother. I love that you're strong enough to travel across the country for family and brave enough to stay even when things got complicated. Those words had warmed Catherine's heart more than any grand romantic gesture could have. The ranch was thriving again, too, with Robert's attention back on the cattle and land, and with Catherine managing the household with quiet efficiency. Everything had found its proper rhythm. The ranch hands were happy and productive, the children were healthy and growing, and visitors often commented on the sense of peace and contentment that seemed to surround the place. Old Pete had been particularly pleased with the changes. "It's good to see the boss smiling again," he told Catherine one day as she brought cold water to the men working on the barn roof. "And it's good to see those children acting like children instead of little adults trying to hold everything." Together, the proposal came on a warm evening in late May, exactly 1 year after Catherine had first arrived at the ranch. Robert had asked her to walk with him to the hill behind the house where Helen was buried. Catherine had been nervous, wondering if he was having second thoughts about their relationship, if being near Helen's grave made him feel guilty about loving her sister. Instead, Robert had knelt beside Helen's headstone and spoken quietly to it as if his wife could hear him. "Helen, I hope you know that Catherine came here because she loved you and wanted to take care of our children," he'd said. "I hope you know that I'll never stop loving you or forget what we had together. But I also hope you'd be happy that our children have someone who loves them as much as you did, and that I've found someone who makes me want to be a better man again." Then he'd stood and turned to Catherine, pulling a simple gold ring from his pocket. "Catherine Morrison, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not to replace Helen, but to build something new with me? To be a mother to her children and a partner to me for whatever years we have left?" Catherine had said yes through tears of joy, and they'd been married a month later in a simple ceremony in the ranch's front yard. Lucy had insisted on scattering wildflower petals, Billy had carried the rings on a small pillow, and baby Rose had clapped and laughed throughout the entire proceedings. Now, 3 months later, Catherine stood in the kitchen of her home, making breakfast for her family. Her husband would be in soon from checking the cattle. Lucy was getting ready for another day of summer adventures. Billy was teaching Rose to stack blocks, and Catherine was expecting their first child together. The news of the pregnancy had brought pure joy to everyone. The children were excited about having a new brother or sister. Robert was practically glowing with happiness, and Catherine felt like her heart might burst from how full her life had become. "Aunt Catherine," Lucy said, running into the kitchen with her hair still unbrushed and her face bright with excitement, "Billy says the new baby might look like Mama because you and Mama looked alike. Is that true?" "It's possible," Catherine said, smoothing Lucy's hair with gentle hands. "But this baby will be special no matter who they look like, just like you and Billy and Rose are special." "I hope they look like you," Lucy said seriously. "Because then it will be like having a little piece of Mama and a little piece of you, all mixed together." Catherine's eyes filled with tears at the wisdom in Lucy's words. That's exactly what this new baby would be, and what their whole blended family had become. A mixture of past and present, of grief and joy, of ending and beginning. Robert came through the door just then, his face wine-burned from the morning ride, but his eyes warm as they found Catherine's. "How are my girls this morning?" he asked, kissing Catherine's cheek and ruffling Lucy's hair. "We're perfect," Catherine said. And she meant it completely, as they sat down to breakfast together. Baby Rose babbling in her high chair, Billy chattering about the new calf he'd seen in the pasture, and Lucy planning her day's adventures. Catherine felt Helen's presence not as a shadow or a sadness, but as a blessing. Her sister had built something beautiful here, and Catherine had been given the incredible gift of helping it continue to grow. Sometimes the best things in life came from the most unexpected places, and sometimes the greatest love stories were the ones that honored the past while embracing the future. Catherine had found her way home at last, not to the place where she'd started, but to the place where she belonged.